Welcome to Matters of State, where we discuss and explore underreported topics, news, and issues that matter to all of us. I'm Lacey Bresky, and today I'm joined by Kevin Ferdowsi and our special guest, former U.S. Ambassador to the Russian Federation, Michael McFaul, who recently wrote a book entitled From Cold War to Hot Peace, an American Ambassador in Putin's Russia. Welcome to the show.
Hey, how are you guys?
We're well, thank you. How are you?
Not too bad.
Great. So you obviously have a variety of interests that are demanding your time, but what prompted you to write this book right now, especially in light of the fact that you stated that it is too soon to draft an account of the events of the Obama era?
Yeah, well, there's actually three stories in one in this book, right? So one is the big story of U.S.-Russia relations over the last 30 years and what happened after we were optimistic about a better relationship after the end of the Cold War. Then there's my kind of personal narrative that pops in and out of the story. But the main story, the third one, is the one I wanted to write now, which was about the Obama era. And that's because as I got out of government, what I noticed was that some on the right were criticizing the Obama administration and President Obama for being too soft on Russia. And somehow the reset is the reason that Putin invaded Ukraine. But then others on the left were saying that we were too harsh with the Russians, and we put in too many aggressive sanctions in 2014, and that was exacerbating tensions. So I wanted to tell the story. So from my point of view, obviously other people might have a different point of view who are in the Obama administration, but to tell how we got there and to answer both sides of those critics on both the right and the left.
Let me ask you a little bit about your experiences while you were living there, because this is it's just a fascinating inside look to what was happening while you were ambassador. We've heard a lot about the disinformation that the Russian governments use to influence the elections in the U.S. What I find interesting is you talk a lot about the disinformation that the Russian government uses in Russia while you were ambassador. Could you talk a little bit about your experience living that?
Sure. And right, we've all heard the words disinformation and fake news now, but several years ago, I experienced it firsthand, both observing what the Kremlin does inside their own country, where, remember, they control all the major television stations, most of the radio stations, most of the media world. They still haven't shut down Twitter and Facebook. That's a good thing, Vkontakte, but they do dominate that market, and they're loose with the truth. They're not constrained by facts. That used to be very frustrating for us when we were dealing with them and kind of back and forth because we were frustrated. We were constrained by the facts. So that's number one. Number two. It also was about us, the United States, Obama, and me, where, they would say pretty outrageous things. I remember, for instance, a newscast that said that Obama had the same ideology as ISIS. And how do you respond to that? How do you argue with that? And then with me, the most sustained disinformation attack was about was a theory that they propagated that I was sent to Russia to support the opposition and to overthrow the Putin regime. And they would splice things that I'd written before and take a few words out to make it sound like that's what I'd written before. They would record my conversations from time to time, and again, splice and dice that to make it sound like I was plotting some revolution, and then, photoshopping things to make it look like I was orchestrating various opposition events. And then the worst of it was when they accused me once with a video. And when I say we, of course, I don't mean the Kremlin directly. They're always cutouts. They're always surrogates. They're more sophisticated than to do it that bluntly.
Yeah.
They circulated a video suggesting I was a pedophile. And that, oh my God, is right. Like, how do you respond to that? You get on Twitter and say, I'm not a pedophile. And then you got, 1,000 Russian bots and trolls arguing with you. And we got better at it over time. We got more sophisticated at how to deal with disinformation. But I would say we lost that struggle while I was ambassador.
Mm-hmm.
And as I look at as our country today, I think we're just not thinking strategically about how to deal with disinformation from foreign governments. We got some homework to do in terms of getting smarter about dealing with that.
So how did you respond, and what would you suggest should be done differently?
Well, we had a big debate with my public affairs team in the embassy and me. I just spent 3 years at the White House, and before that, a couple of years in the Obama campaign.
Mm-hmm.
So my instincts, really shaped by our public relations people, strategic communications people at the White House, was you had to push back and you had to pivot to facts. But that was rather controversial. A lot of more traditional public affairs people, their attitude was, one, let's not respond because that dignifies those that are attacking us. And two, there's a bit of a proclivity within the State Department to be friendly to the government that you're working in. It's called clientitis. And so they didn't want me or the embassy to be the messenger of pushback. They wanted that to come from Washington. And I thought that was the wrong strategy. But we debated that for quite a bit. And eventually, I think my side won, and we did that. Another thing we did was to not necessarily argue directly in a back and forth, but to bring up other news that orthogonally contradicted what was being said. So, for instance, when they were writing about us fomenting revolution, we ran a series must have been February 2012, because that's the leap year. Yeah, 29 days of good news about U.S.-Russian relations. So every day of the week, every day of the month, we put out on Twitter and Facebook an unknown fact of cooperation between the United States and Russia. Again, I don't think we won that debate, but I thought being engaged was better than not. And by the end, I was a rather popular blogger and person on Twitter. I would frequently hit the top 10 list of the most quoted and most active people in that world. But still, we were dealing with the power of the Russian state, in particular on television. That's still where most Russians get their news, and we were really not present in that domain.
I imagine that if you're personally being blamed for fomenting revolution, that's got to be scary. Did you ever fear for your safety?
Yes, there were death threats against me. Sometimes, part of, and again, I want to be clear. What did Putin say? Ordered death threats against McFaul? I think that's highly unlikely. But did he create the permissive conditions for people to think that it was legitimate to say life-threatening things to me? I think they did do that, right? And sometimes it was just crazy people, and we would kind of track it down and be okay. But other times it was serious. I don't want to joke about it. Remember, the first year I was ambassador was the year that our ambassador Stevens was killed in Libya. Yep. And so there was a heightened anxiety within the State Department about these kind of threats towards our diplomats. And it wasn't just me, by the way. I was the most public target as the ambassador, but there were very unpleasant things done against many of my staff as well.
One other thing we wanted to ask you about was that your relationship with Putin.
Yeah.
And that
we're not Facebook friends. Or maybe we are. I don't know, right?
Exactly.
Strange things are on Facebook.
Oh,
maybe
that's
he's trolling me every night as a Bonavana.
So President Bush famously said that he looked into Putin's eyes and saw his soul.
Yeah.
But you've worked with Putin in some manners since 1991, I believe.
That's right.
How would you describe your interactions with him? Because in your book, you discuss him, you're sweating as he's yelling at you.
Yeah. Well, back when I worked with him very briefly in the spring of 1991, I didn't have much of an impression of him at all. He was just a bureaucrat. in charge of interaction with Western organizations, and I was working then for an NGO to promote democracy, by the way, and we were there as the guests of his boss, the mayor of St. Petersburg, Anatoly Sobchak. And that's an important thing I wanted to remind your listeners that, we get accused of meddling in internal affairs, but back then we were, invited to be there. We weren't against the regime. We were working with the new democratically elected leaders of Russia. And then I followed his career over time, and this was an awkward moment that I was one of the first academics to criticize Putin for the anti-democratic steps that he was taking when he became president. In fact, the very first piece I wrote was in March 2000 for the Washington Post, criticizing his autocratic ways, and he was still president-elect. And so I have a large body of academic writing talking about his autocratic ways, and believe me, he knows about that. And just because you join the Obama administration, there's no, magical delete button that you can, or mute. Mute would be nice, right? You can do all writings before, because, when you're in the government, you're part of a team. You're following the policy. You're not just a cowboy doing your own thing. But that created tension right away with me and Putin and his inner circle, those critical things that I had said. And then that was compounded by the fact that I arrived as ambassador right as there were massive demonstrations against Putin and his regime. They were sparked by a falsified election in December 2011. And some of the people involved in those were people that I'd worked with 20, 25 years earlier. And those are just facts of history, right? And so that made it even more convenient for him and his propaganda instruments to accuse me of being sent to work with those opposition figures. And then there was a third thing that annoyed him, that I was told annoyed him by people I know who work closely with him. And remember, this was not my first time living in Russia as ambassador. I'd lived there many, many times over, maybe I think if I add it all up, 6 or 7 years. And I think you would be surprised at how many people I knew, even within the Putin regime, right? It's a pretty complicated set of relationships. Some of those people that went to work with him, I knew in different capacities 25 years earlier. And one of them told me he had just met with Putin, and I saw him at a reception, and he said to me, one of the things that drives Putin nuts about you is that you're so open, you're so public, you're talking about things even in your personal life that Putin doesn't talk about in his personal life inside Russia, and that drives him nuts. And I wasn't your standard ambassador, quiet ambassador. I was told by my boss, Secretary Clinton, to be engaged with Russian society. And because I could speak Russian and had lots of contacts and wasn't afraid to get up in front of 500 people and give a lecture in Russian, I did that, and he didn't like that.
Do you think it's because it endeared you to the public in some manner?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean,
insecurities.
Russia's a complicated society, and we shouldn't generalize, but sure. There were thousands, tens of thousands, people that loved following me on Twitter and Facebook and LiveJournal, and I would show up for universities and the rooms would be packed, and I would have to sign autographs because that generation in particular really responded positively to the kind of new approach I was taking to diplomacy. So much so that I got banned from speaking at universities eventually.
Really?
Because I was just they didn't like those those crowds, and so we did something pretty creative. We started having lectures at my house. Because Spaso House is this giant mansion, and the ballroom seats about 600. And so we would invite students to come to Spaso House and think about that. We would sell those out within an hour of broadcasting them on social media. And think about what that meant. If you show up at Spaso House, you're being recorded by the Russian government. Mm-hmm. I mean, every single person that walks through that gate is taking a risk. And yet,
I'd imagine they'd have a target on their back.
They do. And yet people came. Mm-hmm. So it's a little more complex society than, there's a struggle going on there underneath the surface that I think a lot of people don't realize.
You were talking about your academic background, and you were helping to form policies for the Obama administration. Do you think that that helped you to be both sort of a policy writer and also a policy enforcer?
Yeah, I do. I in a couple of ways. One is I'm an academic, right? I write academic papers, but I also write policy-oriented papers for many, many years. And by doing that, it forces you to think about your arguments, and then people respond to it, and your arguments get better. And so, the idea of the reset that we had in the early years, in the Medvedev years, you can trace those ideas to my writings, years before. In fact, I think I use that word. And so you do that homework before you show up. For me, January 21st, 2009, you've thought about the policies that you're trying to pursue. And I think it did give me a leg up compared to others who had just joined the government and hadn't really thought systematically about what they were seeking to achieve there. The second thing it does is when you get your chance to argue your point, you've done the analytic work and the research before you get into that discussion. So for me, and I write about this in the book, one of the first really thrilling events in this process for me was 2009. We were up in New York, and the president was about to give his major UN General Assembly address, kind of his big statement about Obama foreign policy. And we were debating in that moment whether there should be something about promoting democracy and human rights. And I was on the side that thought there should be. And then Ben Rhodes, he was his chief foreign policy speechwriter at the time. He would let certain people look at the speech and kibitz and add things. And then he would always say, okay, folks, we're done. Thank you very much. The president has signed off on this. And that was a signal to stop debating. And that happened in that speech. And at the time, I thought that what I wanted to be in the speech had gotten left out. And then late that night, I got a call from another White House official, Dennis McDonough, saying, show up in such and such hotel room. And I did. And they're working on the speech. And in walked the president. And remember, I'm not there for the speech. I'm there to deal with the Russians, to talk about Iran. So I'm like Forrest Gump. Why am I here? And I got up to get out and excuse myself. They're like, no, just sit here. And they worked through the speech. And then they got to the end. And that's when Ben said, well, Mr. President, some people think you should be talking about, democracy and universal values. And that's when I realized that that's why they had invited me. And I had just written a book about it, an entire book about advancing democracy abroad. And because I had wrestled through all that theoretical literature, I was ready to go. I mean, I don't know exactly how long it was, but I got to rehearse every single argument in my book, one-on-one with the president. And had I not written that book, I would not have been as prepared to have that conversation with him. So I think there is an advantage to working out your ideas, and then to have a strategy for implementation too. To your second point, that was a little less developed in my academic life, but thinking about implementation is key. And I would say one of my criticisms of us in the Obama administration is we should have spent more time on the implementation side.
We do know that you have an event coming up shortly. So
in 8 minutes, yeah.
Yes.
If we could ask you one more question.
Of course.
You've alluded several times to the fact that you're an academic, you've got an academic background, and a lot of our listeners also have academic backgrounds, or they're young people in the government right now. You talk about in your book, the first time you met Obama, discussing academic international relations theories, realism versus liberalism, and things like that.
Yeah, that was really fun.
I imagine so. I haven't had the pleasure, but if you could say in your practical experience, do you feel that there is some validity to those theories, or I think you said that Obama kind of dismissed it as overly simplistic. What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, he didn't say that it was simplistic. He just said it's a blend, right? And he was reacting to the kind of rigidity of paradigms that I was expressing. And he was saying, in some instances we have to act like realists, and others we should act like liberals. And I think there's some wisdom to that. I do think, though, it was a great advantage to me that I thought in those analytic terms. I think it's good to be disciplined. It's good to know what you think. This idea that, it's all about real life experience, that's just not true. And people that are just kind of reacting to events, I don't think have a mark. They don't make a mark on policy. In fact, somebody very wise said to me long ago, and I think this is really true, that some people are in the government to do things, and some people are in the government to be in various positions. And I saw that. And I think and both are fine, by the way, but I was definitely in the to-do category. And when there was no more to be done, that's when I left. I mean, that's when I decided to leave Moscow, because it was clear to me we weren't going to be able to do more. But I do think it was empowering to have thought through your beliefs beforehand, because there's not a lot of time on the job to sit down and read John Mersheimer or Ken Waltz. So, you're pretty busy, or Eikenberry, so we mentioned a liberal. And I thought the people in the jobs that I was in at my level, those that had a set of coherent ideas beforehand, were a lot more successful in the jobs compared to those that just showed up and then were trying to figure out what they were seeking to achieve. And then the last piece of advice, if I could, something incredibly counterintuitive to me. I would have never said this before I joined the government, but two tools that were invaluable to me as a government official was, one, knowing history. Knowing the history of Russia, but also knowing the history of the Middle East. I participated actively in the Arab Spring policy deliberations. And two, knowing a foreign language. It was incredibly empowering to me to be fluent in Russian, not just as ambassador. That's the obvious thing. It gave me all kinds of entree to people that I would normally not have. And it's just not the same with a translator. There's just not the same rapport. There's a giant schism. But two, because I was a Russian speaker, Obama wanted me in every single meeting that he had with Russians, and he wanted me on the phone when he was speaking to Putin and Medvedev, and that was a great privilege to be the one in the room when others were not, because they didn't speak Russian. So my advice to future secretaries of state, learn about realism and liberalism, but also learn your history and learn a foreign language as well.
Well, thank you so much, Ambassador McFaul, for taking time to join us and for sending us your book. We very much appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
The book is on the shelves now. Cold War to Hot Peace. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Let's do it again sometime.
Absolutely. Yeah, bye-bye. For more information, you can visit us at mattersofstate.org. You can also find us on Twitter at mattersostate or Ambassador McFaul at McFaul. Tune in to us next time. Thanks for listening.
The aggregate of our joy and suffering, thousands of confident religions, ideologies, and economic doctrines, every hero and coward, every creator and destroyer of civilization, every teacher of morals, every corrupt politician, every superstar, every supreme leader, every saint and sinner in the history of our species lived there, on a mote of dust, suspended in a sunbeam. tears of blood spilled by all those generals and emperors, so that in glory and triumph they could become the momentary masters of a fraction of a dot.